Brian Holden had never been the kind of man who looked for trouble. He had spent most of his adult life in the military, serving in high-risk combat zones where the only thing that mattered was the man next to you. The battlefield had been harsh, relentless, and unpredictable, but at least it had rules, unspoken codes of honor that even enemies understood. Civilian life, on the other hand, was a different beast altogether. When he retired and bought a home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, he had naively believed that he was stepping into a peaceful existence, one where he could finally breathe, let his guard down, and simply exist without the constant need to be on edge. He had chosen this place carefully, good property value, low crime rates, and most importantly, a fenced-in yard for Diesel, his loyal service dog. The neighborhood had seemed perfect at first glance. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained sidewalks, families riding their bikes in the evenings, and elderly couples tending to their flower beds. It had all the hallmarks of stability, of normalcy, something he had craved after years of chaos. But Brian had underestimated one thing: people like Karen Bennett. She had been a problem from the moment he moved in. A middle-aged woman with an ever-present scowl and a clipboard permanently attached to her side, she had made it abundantly clear that she disapproved of his presence. At first, Brian had tried to be polite. He had given her a nod whenever he passed her on the street. He had even gone so far as to introduce himself when she first approached him under the guise of welcoming him to the neighborhood. But her eyes had narrowed the moment she saw Diesel. "We have strict pet regulations here," she had said with a tight smile, her gaze lingering on the muscular Belgian Malinois at Brian's side. "Aggressive breeds are not allowed." Brian had kept his response measured, explaining that Diesel was a trained service dog, registered and legally protected. He had even offered to provide documentation if necessary, but Karen had simply pursed her lips and nodded in a way that told him the conversation wasn't over. From that moment on, she had made it her personal mission to make his life difficult. First, there were the complaints, anonymous at first, though everyone knew exactly where they were coming from. She claimed Diesel barked too much, though Brian had security footage proving otherwise. Then came the warnings about his unkempt front yard, despite the fact that he maintained it better than most of his neighbors. It was death by 1,000 cuts, subtle, persistent harassment designed to make him regret ever moving in. But Brian wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. For the most part, he had ignored her, brushing off the passive-aggressive notes left on his mailbox and the way she stared at him whenever he walked Diesel down the street. He had more important things to focus on, like adjusting to civilian life and dealing with the lingering weight of his service. Diesel was more than just a dog to him. He was his tether to reality, the one thing that kept his mind from spiraling into memories of places he would rather forget. When the nightmares came, Diesel was there. When the panic attacks threatened to claw their way through his chest, Diesel was there. He wasn't just a pet, he was a necessity. And Brian would be damned if he let some bitter, overbearing woman dictate whether or not he could keep him. So when he decided to host a small backyard barbecue one Saturday evening, he didn't think twice about it. It was a warm summer night, the kind that made you want to sit outside with a beer in hand, listening to the crackle of a grill and the quiet murmur of conversation. He had invited a few of the neighbors he had managed to befriend: Greg, a retired police officer with a dry sense of humor; James, an engineer who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade; and an elderly couple, the Mitchells, who had been nothing but kind to him since the day he arrived. It wasn't a wild party, just a casual gathering of people enjoying the evening. Diesel lay calmly at Brian's feet, his ears occasionally twitching as he listened to the distant sounds of crickets and passing cars. Everything had been going well until Karen showed up. She hadn't been invited, of course, but that had never stopped her before. Dressed in her usual beige slacks and pastel blouse, she marched onto his property as if she owned it, her expression one of barely concealed contempt. The conversations around the fire pit hushed as she approached, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Brian," she said, her voice saccharine sweet in that way that only meant trouble. "I wasn't aware we were hosting neighborhood events now." Brian sighed inwardly, setting down his beer before turning to face her. "It's just a small get-together," he replied evenly. "Nothing against the rules." Karen's smile tightened. "Well, actually it is. Any gathering with more than 6 people requires prior approval. It's a matter of keeping the community safe and orderly." Brian didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "Safe from what, exactly? We're sitting around a grill, not throwing a rave." Her gaze flickered to Diesel, who remained still at Brian's feet, watching her with quiet intensity. "And there's the issue of your dog," she added. "Some of us are uncomfortable with an animal like that roaming around." Brian clenched his jaw. He had had enough of this. Diesel is a trained service dog. He's not roaming anywhere. He's lying right here, minding his own business. Karen tilted her head, her expression filled with faux concern. "That may be, but we have rules for a reason. Not everyone feels safe around aggressive breeds." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other neighbors exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. They knew better than to get on Karen's bad side. Brian, however, had never been one to back down when he knew he was right. He exhaled slowly, keeping his tone level. "Karen, I appreciate your concern, but this is my property. Diesel is legally allowed to be here, and I don't need your permission to have a few friends over. If you have a real problem, file another complaint. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you left." For a moment, Karen's mask slipped, her lips pressing into a thin line. But then, just as quickly, she forced a smile and took a step back. "Fine," she said lightly. "I just hope you're prepared for the consequences." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving a lingering sense of unease in her wake. Brian watched her go, his gut telling him that this wasn't over. And he was right. Because 20 minutes later, Karen returned with a canister of pepper spray clenched tightly in her fist. Brian barely had time to process the encounter before she returned. He had been standing near the grill, turning over a rack of ribs, when he noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere. The quiet murmur of conversation among his guests had stilled, and when he looked up, he saw Karen striding back toward them with the same rigid determination she had worn earlier. Except this time, something was different. Her face was flushed, her breathing heavier, and there was a manic glint in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Brian's military instincts kicked in immediately, warning him that something wasn't right. Diesel, who had been lying at his feet, sensed it too. His ears perked up, his body tensing as he focused on her. Brian had spent years trusting Diesel's intuition, and right now everything about the dog's posture screamed threat approaching. Karen stopped a few feet away, her grip tightening around a small black canister in her hand. The second Brian recognized what it was, his blood ran cold. Pepper spray. There was no time to react, no chance to de-escalate. In one swift, jerky motion, Karen lifted the canister and pressed down on the nozzle. A sharp, hissing sound filled the air as the aerosolized mist shot forward in a direct stream, aimed right at Brian's face. The burning sensation was instantaneous, a searing wave of pain that spread across his eyes and nostrils, tearing through his senses like wildfire. It felt like his skin was melting, his lungs filling with acid as he gasped for air, staggering backward in agony. But what happened next was even worse. Diesel yelped, a sharp, strangled sound that cut through the chaos like a knife. Brian couldn't see, but he could hear the desperate scratching of Diesel's paws against the ground as he tried to rub the chemical burn from his eyes. The pitiful whine that tore straight through Brian's chest. Diesel was a soldier, trained to withstand gunfire, explosions, the worst that combat had to offer. But he had never been prepared for this. The guests erupted into shouts of disbelief. Someone cursed. Another voice demanded, "What the hell is wrong with you?" But Brian could barely process any of it. He was on his knees now, rubbing furiously at his face, but it only made the burning worse. His throat was closing, his breathing turning ragged as the fumes lodged themselves deep into his sinuses. Then he heard a scream. Not from him. Not from Diesel. From Karen. Through the haze of pain, Brian forced his swollen eyes open just enough to see her stumbling backward, clutching at her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Her face had gone a blotchy, violent shade of red, her body convulsing in sudden panic. It took him a second to understand what was happening. The wind had shifted. The very same spray she had unleashed on Brian and Diesel had blown back into her own face. She gasped, staggered, then tripped over one of the patio chairs. The world seemed to slow down as her body twisted mid-fall, her arms flailing uselessly before she crashed down onto the pavement with a sickening thud. A split second of stunned silence followed before someone muttered, "Oh, shit!" Brian's vision was still blurry, but he could hear her now, writhing on the ground, moaning in pain. His mind fought through the fog, his survival instincts still pushing him to assess the situation. Was she faking? Was this another stunt? But the gasping, choking noises she was making were real, and Brian knew enough about pepper spray to recognize the early signs of an allergic reaction. Even through the agony ripping through his own face, his training kicked in. His body moved on autopilot. His first priority was Diesel. Blinking rapidly, he reached out blindly, feeling for his dog's thick fur. Diesel was still struggling, his body twitching in distress. Brian forced his shaking hands into his pocket, pulling out the small bottle of saline solution he always carried. His fingers fumbled with the cap, the pain in his eyes making it nearly impossible to focus. Gritting his teeth, he tilted Diesel's head back and squeezed the liquid directly into his eyes. The dog jerked at first, whining, but Brian held him steady, whispering, "Easy, buddy. I got you." Greg, the retired cop, was suddenly at his side, helping hold Diesel still. "Jesus, Brian, you okay?" "Not even close," Brian rasped, his voice hoarse from the burning in his throat. Greg cursed under his breath before turning toward Karen, who was still clawing at her throat. "She's going into shock." Brian didn't have the energy for sympathy, but years of discipline didn't just vanish overnight. Through sheer willpower, he forced himself to focus. He had two priorities now: Diesel and making sure this lunatic didn't die in his backyard. His military training surged back to the surface, pushing past the pain. Evaluate. React. Prioritize. "Someone call an ambulance," he ordered, his voice rough but steady. "I already did," one of the neighbors shouted. "Good," Brian growled, squeezing more saline into Diesel's eyes. The dog blinked rapidly, his breathing still labored, but the sharp whining had lessened. He was recovering. One problem solved. Now for the other one. Brian staggered to his feet, vision still blurred but clearing enough to see Karen's pathetic form on the ground. She was curled up, shaking, tears and snot dripping down her face as she gasped like a fish out of water. Greg knelt beside her, checking her pulse. Her throat's swelling up. "She needs epinephrine, but I doubt she carries it," Brian exhaled sharply. Of course she didn't. Karen wasn't just some power-hungry suburban tyrant, she was also a goddamn idiot. The distant wail of approaching sirens filled the night air. Good, let them handle this mess. Brian had done his part. He turned away, his body aching. But just as he stepped toward Diesel, he heard Karen's voice, raw, shaky, but still venomous. He attacked me," she wheezed. "His dog, I was just trying to defend myself." Brian stopped cold. For a split second, he almost laughed. Even after nearly killing herself, even after attacking a trained service animal, she still had the audacity to play the victim. Greg shot her a look of sheer disgust. "Are you serious right now?" But Karen wasn't listening. She was fumbling for her phone, her swollen fingers barely able to grip it. And before Brian could stop her, she had dialed 911. Her voice was weak, but the words were clear as day. "There's a dangerous man here. He set his dog on me. I need help." Brian stared at her, blood roaring in his ears. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This wasn't just petty revenge. She had just lied to emergency services. And in the eyes of the law, if she framed it correctly, she could turn this into a deadly serious accusation. The realization hit like a gut punch. This wasn't over, it was just getting started. Brian stood there, his muscles locked, his breath still uneven from the burning in his throat, his vision blurry but clearing just enough to see Karen's swollen, but blotchy face twisted into an expression of pure malice. Even on the ground, struggling to breathe, she clutched her phone with a death grip, her trembling fingers pressing against the screen as she continued speaking into the receiver, her voice ragged but insistent. He's dangerous. His dog is trained to attack. She coughed violently, her body convulsing as her airways betrayed her. I was just trying to protect myself. Brian knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about calling for help. She had already heard the sirens. The ambulance was minutes away. No, this was something else entirely. She was laying the groundwork. Greg saw it too. He turned toward Brian, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was about to crack a tooth. "She's framing you," he muttered under his breath. "Right here, in real time." Brian felt the weight of it settle into his chest like a lead anchor. He had been in situations like this before, not in suburban backyards, not over barbecues and property disputes, but in places where the wrong word, the wrong assumption, could mean the difference between life and death. He had learned, early on, that perception often outweighed reality. It didn't matter what actually happened. It only mattered what people believed happened. And Karen, even through her own stupidity and incompetence, understood that too. Brian forced himself to think clearly, despite the lingering burn in his lungs and the exhaustion creeping into his muscles. He had spent years in combat, learning how to analyze threats and react accordingly. And right now, Karen wasn't the real threat. The real threat was the first responder who arrived on the scene and made a judgment call based on incomplete information. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night, bouncing off the houses and trees, making the scene feel surreal, almost like it was happening to someone else. The first vehicle to arrive was an ambulance, its tires screeching slightly as it pulled up beside the curb. Two paramedics jumped out, their eyes darting between Brian, Karen, and Diesel, who was still blinking rapidly, his body pressed against Brian's leg, seeking reassurance. One of the medics, a tall woman with sharp eyes, knelt beside Karen immediately, her expression shifting from professional detachment to wary concern as she took in the state of her face and throat. "Jesus, what happened here?" Karen's fingers tightened around her phone. Her voice was weak but deliberate. "He attacked me." Brian didn't move, didn't even blink. He had spent enough time in interrogation rooms to know that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. Greg, on the other hand, let out a sharp breath. "Oh, give me a break." The medic shot him a warning look before turning back to Karen. "Who attacked you?" Karen coughed, her eyes darting toward Brian, him, and his dog. There it was. The medic's body language changed instantly, a subtle but dangerous shift. Her posture stiffened slightly, and Brian could see the mental gears turning. A man and a large dog. A woman on the ground, injured. The optics weren't good. They never were. But before the medic could ask another question, the police arrived. Two officers stepped out, one male, one female, their hands already resting near their holsters. They moved with the slow, measured steps of people assessing a situation that could spiral in any direction. Karen, the opportunistic snake that she was, took full advantage of their arrival. She let out a dramatic gasp, forcing another cough as she pointed a shaking finger toward Brian. I told you, he sixed his dog on me." The male officer, a broad-shouldered guy who looked like he had probably played football in high school, turned his gaze toward Brian. "Sir, step away from the dog." Brian did not move. He had already seen where this was going. He had seen it in combat zones, in high-pressure situations where misinformation spread like wildfire. If he moved now, if he backed away from Diesel as if there was something to hide, he would lose control of the narrative. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice level but firm. "And neither did my dog." The female officer, a few steps behind her partner, tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then why is she saying you did? Greg, who had been standing off to the side, finally lost whatever patience he had left. He took a step forward, his hands raised in exasperation. Are you kidding me right now? I watched the whole damn thing. This lunatic showed up, sprayed him and his dog with pepper spray, then got herself in the crossfire like an idiot. And now she's turning this into some kind of attack? The male cop turned his head slightly, clearly weighing Greg's words. And you are? Retired NYPD. That gave them both pause. The female officer narrowed her eyes. You're saying she was the aggressor? I'm not saying it, Greg scoffed. I'm telling you. Oh, I saw it with my own 2 eyes, and so did half the people here. The officers exchanged glances. That was the problem with public disputes. Too many witnesses, too many angles. It complicated things. Karen must have realized that too because she switched tactics. She let out another weak cough, her voice trembling as she turned her attention back to the medics. I think I need to go to the hospital. My throat, my breathing. The medic next to her frowned, pulling out a small flashlight and checking her pupils. Your throat is definitely inflamed. Do you have any allergies? Karen hesitated. It was barely noticeable, but Brian caught it. No, she said finally. Liar. The medic sighed. We'll transport you for evaluation, but if this was just exposure to pepper spray, it'll pass. Karen turned her head slightly, her swollen eyes finding Brian's through the haze of tears. There was something there. Not fear, not pain, smugness. Because even if she had lost this battle, she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Brian knew, in that moment, that this wasn't over. It wasn't even close to being over. Sure enough, as they lifted Karen onto the stretcher, one of the officers turned toward him. We're going to need you to come down to the station and give a statement. Brian exhaled slowly. Am I being detained? The officer hesitated. Not at the moment, but then I'm not going anywhere, Brian cut in. I have nothing to hide. I'll give a statement. Right here, right now. With my lawyer present. Greg muttered a low curse under his breath. Smart move. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fine, but don't leave town. Brian let out a humorless laugh. Oh, don't worry. I'm not going anywhere. He watched as the ambulance doors closed behind Karen, the flashing red lights reflecting off the nearby houses as the vehicle pulled away. And he knew, deep in his gut, that she wasn't done with him yet. Brian barely slept that night. Even after rinsing his face for what felt like hours, the remnants of the pepper spray still lingered in his skin, burning in the creases of his eyelids. His sinuses still raw from inhaling the chemicals. Diesel was in better shape, but the attack had rattled him in a way Brian had never seen before. The dog, normally a steady presence, had stayed unnervingly close, his massive frame pressed against Brian's legs every time he moved, his ears constantly flicking at even the slightest sound. He was on edge, and Brian couldn't blame him. Something about the entire situation felt unfinished, as if Karen's departure in the ambulance had only been a temporary retreat. He had seen men like her before, not on battlefields, but in bureaucratic offices, in chain of command meetings, where people who had never seen real conflict tried to flex their authority over those who had. They never fought fair. They never admitted fault. And they never let things go. The first official consequence came the next morning. Brian had just finished feeding Diesel when a sharp knock echoed through his house. He opened the door to find a uniformed officer standing on his porch, a clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. Brian didn't recognize him, but that didn't mean much. He hadn't exactly taken the time to get acquainted with local law enforcement since moving here. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable. Mr. Holden, the officer began, his tone neutral but firm. We need to discuss an official complaint that was filed against you last night. Brian didn't react, didn't so much as blink. By Karen Bennett, he guessed. The officer gave a short nod. She's alleging that you instigated an attack against her. She claims that you intentionally commanded your dog to attack, and that when she attempted to defend herself, you physically assaulted her, resulting in her injuries. Brian let out a slow breath through his nose. He had expected this. Hell, he had known it the second she started talking to the medics. Karen had never planned to win the initial confrontation. That was just step one. Step two was turning herself into the victim. That's not what happened, Brian said evenly. And you know it. The officer shifted slightly, flipping through the papers on his clipboard. We have conflicting statements. Some witnesses support your version of events. Others ones who seem to be friendly with MS. Bennett are backing her claims. Given that she was hospitalized and you were not, she has a stronger case for pressing charges. That nearly made Brian laugh. She was hospitalized because she sprayed herself in the face. That's not an injury. That's karma. The officer didn't crack a smile. Be that as it may, she's pursuing legal action. There's a temporary restraining order filed against you, which means you are not to come within 50 feet of MS. Bennett, under any circumstances. If you violate this, you will be arrested immediately. Additionally, she's requesting a formal investigation into your service dog, claiming that Diesel is a dangerous animal and should be removed from your care pending further evaluation. That made Brian's stomach turn. The idea of losing Diesel, even temporarily, made his hands curl into fists at his sides. This wasn't just about petty revenge anymore. This was about taking something from him. You know this is bullshit, he said, his voice quieter now but sharper. You know exactly what kind of person she is. The officer hesitated, and that pause told Brian everything he needed to know. I don't make the rules, the cop finally said. I just enforce them. If you want to fight this, get a lawyer. Brian exhaled slowly. I already have one. The officer nodded once, handed him the official paperwork, then turned and walked back to his squad car, leaving Brian standing in his doorway, staring down at the restraining order and animal control notice in his hands. Greg showed up 20 minutes later, looking like he had barely gotten any sleep either. He took one look at Brian's face and scowled. Let me guess. She's pushing this as far as it'll go. Brian handed him the papers without a word. Greg flipped through them, muttering a string of curses under his breath before shaking his head. They're trying to fast-track this thing. If she convinces a judge that Diesel is a public safety threat, they'll take him from you before you even have a chance to fight back. Brian's grip on the edge of the countertop tightened. That's not going to happen. Greg exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Listen, I made a few calls last night. Karen's been pulling stunts like this for years. She's gone after neighbors before, usually with smaller complaints, but you're the first one she's actually taken to court. My guess? She's trying to set a precedent. She wants you gone, and if she wins this, it won't just be about you. It'll be about her having the power to do this to anyone she doesn't like. Brian nodded slowly. So what do we do? Greg smirked. We hit back. Brian raised an eyebrow. Legally, I assume. Greg shrugged. For now. The first step was getting ahead of the investigation. Brian's lawyer was already filing motions to challenge Karen's claims, demanding access to the hospital records that would prove her injuries were nothing but self-inflicted exposure to pepper spray. Meanwhile, Greg was working his own angle, digging into Karen's history of false reports and connecting with people who had been on the receiving end of her previous campaigns of harassment. The more they found, the clearer the pattern became. Karen had a long history of manipulating the system to get what she wanted. The problem was that she was good at it. Every complaint she had ever filed was just barely within legal boundaries. Every accusation she made was difficult to disprove outright. And the people she targeted? Most of them had either moved away or settled quietly to avoid dragging things out. But Brian wasn't going anywhere. The breaking point came when he got a call from his lawyer 2 days later. You need to be prepared, she said, her voice brisk, professional. Karen's attorney just filed a motion claiming that you have a history of aggression. Brian frowned. What history? There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then they submitted an old military incident report. Brian felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't possible. His records were sealed. His discharge was honorable. He had done nothing wrong. But Karen didn't need the truth. She just needed enough doubt to cast a shadow over his character. His grip on the phone tightened. What did they find? His lawyer hesitated. It's vague, redacted in parts, but it suggests that you were involved in an altercation during active duty. Nothing was confirmed, no charges, but it implies violence. Brian closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. He knew exactly what report they had found. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't even a fight. It was classified, and she had no right to have it. Greg's voice cut through his thoughts. What is it? Brian opened his eyes. It's war now, he muttered, and she just made the first real mistake. Brian had always known that Karen wouldn't stop, but he hadn't expected her to go this far. Digging into his military records was one thing illegal, infuriating, but ultimately a bureaucratic maneuver. The attempt to have Diesel taken away was worse, a deliberate attack, not just on him, but on the one thing keeping him grounded. But this was different. Someone had just broken into his house. Someone had been inside his home with the intent to send a message, and the fact that they had been stupid enough to get caught didn't make it any less dangerous. Brian kept his grip tight on the man's wrist, his other hand pressing against the back of his neck, keeping him pinned against the wall. He could feel the rapid pulse under his fingers, the sharp intake of breath as the guy realized just how much trouble he was in. He wasn't some hardened criminal. He was younger, mid-20s at most, dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, trying to look intimidating but failing miserably. Brian had seen real threats, had faced men who wanted to kill him, and this kid wasn't one of them. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. Desperation made people reckless, and Karen had fed this kid a lie. Who sent you? Brian asked, his voice low, controlled. The man shifted under his grip, testing his strength, but Brian didn't budge. He had been trained for this, had lived in moments like this. The man swallowed hard before muttering, I don't know what you're talking about. Brian exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to slam him into the wall again. You broke into my house with a can of spray paint. You weren't here to steal anything. You were here to send a message. So tell me, what was the message? The man hesitated, his breathing ragged. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, She said you'd break first. A slow, cold wave of understanding washed over Brian. Karen had escalated. She had tried to push him until he cracked, and when that didn't work, she had found someone else to do her dirty work. This wasn't about lawsuits anymore. It wasn't about legal technicalities or restraining orders. This was a game of pressure, and she was testing just how much force it would take to break him. Brian's grip tightened involuntarily before he forced himself to let go, stepping back just enough to let the man breathe, but not enough to give him any illusion of escape. You're going to tell me everything, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Or I'm calling the cops, and I promise you, they won't be as patient as I am. The man wiped at his mouth, wincing. He was still trying to act tough, but the fear in his eyes was real. It was just supposed to be a warning, he admitted. Just some spray paint, nothing serious. She said if we made you nervous, you'd back off. Brian latched onto the word immediately. How many of you? The man hesitated again, but this time Brian didn't wait for an answer. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Don't make me ask twice. The man flinched. It's just a few of us. She paid us to keep an eye on you, mess with your stuff, nothing major. Brian felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Karen had hired people to intimidate him, to break into his home, to make him feel like he was under siege. And that changed everything. The front door suddenly burst open, and Greg stepped inside, gun drawn, his expression dark. Jesus Christ, Brian, I saw the window. What the hell's going on? His eyes locked onto the intruder, and his jaw clenched. You want me to handle this? Brian shook his head, though the temptation was there. No, he's talking. Greg didn't lower his weapon, but he nodded slowly. Smart kid. Keep talking. The man shifted uncomfortably. Look, I didn't sign up for this, all right? She told us it was just to spook you, but this, he gestured toward the broken window. I didn't think she'd push it this far. Brian's voice was eerily calm. And yet, here you are, in my house, in the middle of the night. The man looked away, shame flickering across his face. I just needed the money. Brian studied him for a long moment before exhaling slowly. You're going to leave. Right now. And then you're going to tell Karen that her little game isn't working. You're going to tell her that I'm not backing down. And if I ever see you near my house again, you won't have time to explain yourself before the cops get involved. Do you understand me? The man nodded quickly, relief washing over his face as Brian finally let go of his wrist. He didn't wait for another warning. He bolted for the door, nearly tripping over himself as he disappeared into the night. Greg holstered his gun, shaking his head. You should have let me handle it. Brian didn't respond right away. He stared at the broken window, the cold air seeping into the house, the distant sound of the man's footsteps fading into silence. This was never about him, he finally said. Karen is testing the limits. She wants to see how far she can push before I snap. Greg folded his arms. And? Brian turned to face him, his expression unreadable. She's about to find out. The next morning, Brian's lawyer filed a new motion, a criminal complaint against Karen for conspiracy to commit harassment, trespassing, and incitement to commit a crime. The evidence was weak for now, but that wasn't the point. The point was to put her on the defensive. For too long, Karen had been the one dictating the pace, controlling the situation with lies and manipulation. That ended now. Greg, meanwhile, had tracked down the other men Karen had hired. It didn't take much. The idiot from the night before had spilled everything the second Greg applied some pressure, giving names, details, even the exact amount Karen had paid them. It wasn't much, just a few $100 each. Cheap intimidation. Sloppy work. But it was enough to prove intent. Enough to prove that this wasn't just a neighborly dispute gone wrong, it was a deliberate, calculated attack. Karen must have realized that too, because by the end of the week she had filed a counter motion. This time she wasn't just going after Diesel. She was going after Brian directly. Her lawyer argued that Brian was a violent individual, that his military record spoke for itself, that his past she had illegally accessed showed a pattern of aggression. She wanted him removed from the neighborhood entirely, not just legally, permanently. She wanted to force him out of his home. Brian sat in his lawyer's office, scanning the latest documents, feeling the steady, slow burn of anger settle deep in his chest. Greg leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. She's really trying to bury you. Brian's fingers tightened around the papers. He had fought too hard, lost too much, to let someone like Karen Bennett take away the life he had built. He set the papers down, his jaw tight. Then, let's make sure she regrets it. Brian had always known the moment would come when Karen would go too far, when she would make a mistake so blatant, so reckless, that it would turn the entire situation against her. For weeks, she had played the long game, using the legal system as a weapon, manipulating the rules, stacking every piece of evidence in her favor while carefully hiding her own wrongdoing. She had made him the villain in a carefully constructed narrative, feeding the court her version of events, painting herself as the helpless victim of an unstable military veteran with an aggressive service dog. She had built her case on exaggerations, distortions, outright lies, and yet she had managed to convince just enough people that she was telling the truth. But Brian had learned something about people like her: they always overplay their hand. The official hearing to determine Diesel's fate had been set for that morning, and Brian had arrived early, his lawyer at his side, Greg a few steps behind, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was smaller than he had expected, a sterile, windowless space with harsh fluorescent lighting and rows of wooden benches. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, sat at the front, flipping through the case file as attorneys from both sides took their places. Karen was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, her face the picture of quiet suffering, dressed in soft beige tones as if she had carefully curated her appearance to reinforce the image of a woman who had been wronged. She didn't look at Brian, but he could see the tightness in her posture, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table just a little too hard. She was nervous. Good. The first hour was nothing new. Her lawyer went over the same tired arguments, claiming that Diesel had shown clear aggression toward Karen, that she had acted in self-defense, that the presence of a dangerous animal in the neighborhood was a violation of community safety standards. Brian's attorney countered with cold, hard facts, presenting video footage from the night of the incident, showing Karen as the aggressor, pepper spray canister in hand, attacking both Brian and Diesel unprovoked. Greg had provided testimony, as had other witnesses who had seen exactly what had happened, and for the first time, Brian could see the cracks forming in Karen's carefully crafted story. And then it happened. Brian wasn't sure what prompted it. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe it was the realization that her version of events was beginning to collapse under scrutiny, but when Karen took the stand, she lost control. Her lawyer had barely finished asking his first question when she launched into a speech about how unsafe she had felt, how threatened she had been, how Brian had a history of violence that no one was willing to acknowledge. She spoke too quickly, her voice rising, her emotions just a little too performative, and then she made her mistake. "I did what I had to do," she said, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. "I saw his file. I know what kind of man he is. The things he's done, the reports they tried to hide, I wasn't going to wait until it was too late." Brian felt the shift in the room the second the words left her mouth. His lawyer's eyes flickered with sudden interest. The judge's expression sharpened. Greg muttered a low curse under his breath. Brian exhaled slowly, deliberately. "You saw my file?" Karen faltered, as if realizing what she had just admitted. The judge set her pen down. "Ms. Bennett," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Could you clarify how you obtained Mr. Holden's military records?" "His sealed military records." Karen's lips parted, but no sound came out. Brian's lawyer leaned forward, his voice smooth as silk. "Yes, I'd love to hear more about that. Because, as we all know, accessing classified military documents without proper clearance is a federal offense." Karen's face went pale. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside her, flipping through his notes as if searching for some kind of escape. But there wasn't one. Karen had just incriminated herself on record in front of a judge, under oath. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her mistake hanging in the air like a gunshot. Brian didn't smile. He didn't react at all. He just watched as the reality of the situation finally sank in for her. She had just lost. The judge cleared her throat. "Given this new development, I am placing an immediate hold on all proceedings regarding Mr. Holden's service dog until we conduct a formal investigation into how Ms. Bennett obtained classified documents. Furthermore, I strongly suggest that both parties consider reaching a private resolution before this matter escalates any further." Brian knew exactly what that meant. Karen was about to have much bigger problems than a fabricated dog attack. The hearing ended shortly after that, but the fallout was immediate. By the time Brian stepped outside, Greg already had his phone to his ear, speaking to one of his old contacts. "Yeah, you heard that right," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "She just admitted to a felony in open court. You might want to get ahead of this before it blows up." He paused, then chuckled. "No, I don't think she realized what she was saying until it was too late." Brian exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders finally begin to ease. It wasn't over yet. Karen was still dangerous, and people like her had a way of clawing for survival even when they were backed into a corner. But she had made a fatal error, and now she was the one on defense. She was the one who had to answer for her actions. And Brian? He wasn't going anywhere. Brian had seen a lot of people fall apart under pressure. It happened in war zones, in interrogation rooms, in courtrooms just like this one, where the weight of their own arrogance finally caught up with them. He had watched men, confident and untouchable, realize too late that they had made a fatal mistake, that the lie they had so carefully built had started to collapse, that there was no escape. He saw that same realization in Karen's face as she sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her eyes darting between her lawyer and the judge, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. For weeks she had been on the offensive, twisting reality to fit her version of events, weaponizing the legal system against him, making herself the victim. And now, with a single misstep, she had handed him everything he needed to take her down. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of the hearing, Karen's lawyer filed a motion to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. That was legal code for "she lied to me and I'm not going down with her." Without legal representation, Karen had no way to fight the charges that were now being stacked against her: unlawful access to classified military records, filing false police reports, perjury, and harassment. And the moment Greg's contacts in law enforcement got wind of what had happened, the investigation into how she had obtained Brian's sealed records moved at lightning speed. Within 48 hours, the truth came out. Karen hadn't just gone through unofficial channels to dig up dirt on Brian. She had bribed a low-level clerk in a military records office to get access to files that she had no legal right to see. It wasn't just an ethical violation. It wasn't just a legal gray area. It was a felony. The clerk had already lawyered up and was cooperating with the investigation, and as soon as it became clear that Karen had orchestrated everything, the authorities made their move. Brian wasn't home when the police showed up at Karen's house, but Greg was. He had parked across the street, pretending to be on a phone call when the squad cars arrived, watching as the officers knocked on her door, as she opened it with a forced smile, as they informed her that she was under arrest. He saw the exact moment the reality hit her, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her mouth moved like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. She had spent years controlling people through intimidation, through legal loopholes, through carefully crafted lies. And now she was realizing that there was no one left to manipulate. Greg had filmed the whole thing, not for the internet, not for revenge, but for Brian, because after everything, Brian deserved to see it. When he showed Brian the video later that night, Brian had watched in silence, his face unreadable, his expression calm. When the screen went dark, he had handed the phone back to Greg, exhaling slowly before saying, "Good." That was it. No celebration, no gloating. Just quiet satisfaction that justice had finally caught up to the person who had tried to take everything from him. Karen spent 3 days in jail before she was released on bail, but by then her reputation was in shambles. News had spread quickly, and the people who had once backed her, the neighbors who had whispered about Brian, the ones who had signed letters in support of her complaints, had all turned their backs on her. Because when it came down to it, people didn't like being associated with someone who had been exposed as a liar and a criminal. She had spent so much time trying to make Brian look like the villain that she hadn't considered what would happen when the truth came out that she was the real threat all along. The final blow came when her house was put up for sale. She had no choice between the legal fees, the impending court battles, and the complete destruction of her standing in the community. She couldn't stay. The sign went up 2 weeks after her arrest, and just like that, Karen Bennett was gone. Brian didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. By the time her car disappeared down the road for the last time, he was sitting in his backyard, Diesel lying at his feet, the sounds of the neighborhood settling into something that finally, after all these months, felt peaceful. The air smelled like freshly cut grass, like charcoal from someone else's barbecue, like normalcy. He ran a hand absently through Diesel's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing, the warmth of his presence, the thing that had almost been taken from him. You know, Greg said from where he sat across from him, a beer in hand, most people would have moved after all that. Brian smirked. I've moved enough. Greg nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. I think she's really gone for good. Brian exhaled. Doesn't matter. If she ever tries anything again, she won't have the power to pull it off. Greg grinned. That's a polite way of saying you'll bury her if she does. Brian didn't deny it. The thing about people like Karen was that they never really changed. They found new places, new targets, new ways to twist the system in their favor. But she had made a mistake coming after him. Because he had done something that none of her previous victims had done, he had fought back. And he had won. As the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, Brian leaned back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. At peace. He wasn't naive enough to think that life would suddenly be perfect, that there wouldn't be more battles ahead. But for the first time since moving here, he knew one thing for certain. This was his home, and no one, not Karen, not anyone was ever going to take it from him again.